Greetings everyone, and thank you all for joining us for today's AMA on the AMD Ryzen 5000 series of processors. I'm Mithun from Digit and I'll be your host today. This session is sponsored by AMD and the materials being presented today have been provided to us by AMD. We'll be delving into the details of the microarchitecture, looking at performance in gaming, content creation, and other important areas. And we'll be looking at some of the important features that the AMD ecosystem has thanks to the introduction of Zen 3. The content will be centered around performance improvement attained by Zen 3 over Zen 2. And if you wish to get more information regarding Zen 3 processors, then we've also reviewed two of the Ryzen processors, and the review is live on our website. So you can always head over there and get more information. During the registration process, we did collect several questions from you guys for today's AMA. AMA stands for Ask Me Anything. And we'll be answering those questions. Along with that, we'll also be answering questions live. So make use of the chat functionality over here to send us your questions, and we'll answer them one after the other towards the end of the session. AMD reps are also here, so if you wish to have questions answered by them, please feel free to put those questions in for AMD as well. Please note the chat is moderated. Now we're going to wait for about 2 more minutes, I believe, to let more people join in, and then we can commence with the AMA. That's going to be just 2 more minutes. We are already seeing quite a lot of questions coming in the chat. Please do keep them coming in. We are looking at those. And okay, we already have some preliminary questions which are kind of easy to answer. Are we doing a gaming headphone giveaway? No. Will it come in a laptop? That's a different set of silicon which AMD will be coming out with, but they have not revealed anything about Ryzen 5000 series coming on the laptop, and AMD doesn't comment on future launches, so you actually have to wait for those things to come out. We have folks from all over the country, including Jammu and Kashmir. Okay, so plenty of representation, and we have some familiar faces as well. And it's 5:05, which means we can start with the presentation. We'll switch over to the slides and move on. So we're starting off by looking at the journey of AMD's Zen microarchitecture. It started off back in 2017 with the first Ryzen 1000 series of processors, which were all on the 14 nanometer process by FinFET, TSMC. This was followed by Zen Plus, which moved to the 12 nanometer process, which was a bit more power efficient. And the introduction of the Ryzen 1000 series, that is the first Zen microarchitecture, brought with it a 52% IPC uplift compared to the previous generation. And the previous generation was bulldozer and excavator. Now 52% is a massive increment in the domain of processors for IPC. And in case you're wondering what IPC is, it stands for instructions per cycle or instructions per clock. Then came Zen 2, where we saw another 15% IPC uplift and the move to a more efficient 7 nanometer process mode. And in November this year, we saw the introduction of Zen 3, that is AMD's latest microarchitecture, which is a ground up redesign that has resulted in significant performance gains and also happens to be the topic of today's AMA. So at the onset, AMD had three design goals for Zen 3. These were to increase the performance by focusing on IPC, and closely tied to that was the objective to reduce latency between the cores. And the third, we have efficiency, which is considered in terms of performance per watt. That is one of the ways of looking at efficiency, and that's always paramount when you're looking at processors. Now, once we have these design goals out of the way, let's take a look at the major changes that were incorporated in Zen 3 versus Zen 2. Now, this was a ground up redesign, so there were a lot of different changes. All of the elements that you see in front of you have to be balanced. So an improvement in one aspect is closely tied to another element of the microarchitecture, and the two need to be tweaked in order to get a good performance gain overall. Most of the improvements that we see here are concentrated in the front end, followed by the execution elements, and then in the load store aspects of the processor core. The front end deals with the branch predictor logic, how the instructions are fetched and then broken down into macro ops before being sequenced within the integer as well as the floating point pipelines. We see that AMD has improved bandwidth, and it also has tweaked with the sequencing of instructions, which is now done in a much faster fashion and with finer grained switching. Then we have the execution part, which deals with the actual operation being performed on the operands, that is where all the instructions are run. We see improvements with both the integer as well as the floating point pipelines. Latency has also been reduced for certain integer and floating point operations, and the dispatch, which is the bit over here, is wider, and fmac, which is an instruction, has been sped up by reducing by one cycle. Then we get into the load store elements, that is towards the end, which also show bandwidth improvements along with more flexibility in dealing with varying operations. More resources have also been added for the TLB, that is the translation local site buffer. And overall, this is a brief overview of the major changes between Zen 3 and Zen 2. If you have any questions, please let us know in the chat and we'll come back to the slide later on. Now, how massive an improvement was attained is the major topic of discussion. AMD has stated they've managed to get 19% IPC uplift. Now, what this means is that compared to Zen 2 processors, Zen 3 processors can execute 19% more instructions per cycle. This simply means that you'll get more performance within the same amount of time. IPC, along with frequency, is what determines the performance of your processor. So when you combine high IPC along with high frequency, you get much higher performance gains, and you'll see those in the slides to come. Before we do that, let's see how all of these changes that are listed over here have contributed to the overall performance gain. The 19% figure is achieved by taking a Zen 2 processor and a Zen 3 processor, running them at the same fixed frequency of 4 GHz using the exact same setup, and then running multiple workloads to see how much performance gain is observed in each workload. So in effect, this 19% figure is a geometric mean of the results obtained from 25 different workloads. In this graph, we can see the front end, load store, and the execution engine have contributed the most to the performance gains. This is followed by the cache prefetching, micro op cache, and the branch predictor. Now that we've seen the breakup of the 19% uplift, let's take a look at all the different workloads that were tested in order to get to this magic figure. Now, I'd like to state again that these numbers were obtained by comparing a Zen 2 processor with a Zen 3 processor in the same system, with both processors clocked at 4 GHz. Here we have a mix of different CPU intensive workloads comprising of gaming, content creation, virtual reality, and 3D modeling. This is coupled with a lot of popular industry benchmarks which we are all familiar with. If you've observed the different workloads, then you'll see that 14 of these graphs are for video games, and that tells you where the Ryzen 5000 series of processors really excel. Most video games tend to use about 4 to 6 CPU cores, and having performant, low latency cores works out in favor of most AAA titles in the market. You'll also see that there's a mix of APIs used in each of these games. We see Vulkan, DirectX 9, 11, and 12 represented. Also, a lot of the games shown here use different game engines. So you have high performance gains across different graphics APIs, and they're all running on a variety of game engines. Now, video games in general favor low latency and high performance cores. So let's take a look at another major change made in Zen 3 which helped in this aspect. Now here we see the core complex present within each CCD, that is the core compute die. On the left we have Zen 2 and on the right we have Zen 3, which powers the newly released AMD Ryzen 5000 processors. In Zen 2, each CCD, that's this aspect over here, has two CCX. You have one in orange, one in pink. Each CCX in turn has a maximum of 4 cores, and each CCX also has 16 MB of L3 cache, that's level 3 cache. If the cores from this particular CCX need to talk to cores of this CCX, they have to go through an interconnect in the middle. In Zen 3, you have two CCXs which have been combined into one, and each CCX has a maximum of 8 cores, and the entire CCX has access to the entire 32 megabytes of L3 cache. So over here, each of these cores could only access 16 megabytes of L3 cache and took a little convoluted path to get here, whereas in Zen 3, each core has access to the entirety of the 32 megabytes of L3 cache. That reduces latency a lot, and there is no need for any of the cores to use the interconnect to talk to the other core. And we'll see how this happens in the next slide. Over here we have the Zen 3 cache hierarchy. Each core has a 32 byte instruction as well as a 32 byte data cache, followed by 512 kilobytes of L2 cache, and those in turn talk to 32 megabytes of L3 cache, which is also called a victim cache. If any of the core have to talk to each other, let's say core 0 has to talk to core 7, then they can do so quickly since the entirety of the L3 cache is now combined. In the previous scenario, you had to go through an interconnect to get into the L3 cache of the other CCX and then talk to the other core. Now this was a close-up of the CCX hierarchy or other topology, and next we'll be seeing the topology of the entire processes from the CCD and CIOD perspective. So these are the two chiplets along with the IO die. In case you've seen the first slide, let me bring that one up. You can see this is how a Zen 3 processor looks like when you take off the heatsink on the top. So each of these little things are the compute chiplets, and this is the IO die. Coming back, so you can see how the CCDs are interconnected with the CIODs using Infinity Fabric, which is AMD's interconnect technology, which is very fast and tied with DDR4 RAM frequency. And then the CIOD communicates with the RAM. So that's how your entire communication happens within the processor and the memory. Moving on, we can see that Zen 3 has the 19% uplift, which we've gone through multiple times over. This was calculating with the two processors set at 4 GHz, that is Zen 2 and Zen 3. And here in this particular slide, we are doing away with that 4 GHz limit, and we are comparing a Zen 2 processor at its advertised speed with Zen 3 processor at its advertised speed. Now this is a gaming benchmark chart, and here we see that the Ryzen 9 3900 XT compared with the Ryzen 9 5900X. Both CPUs have 12 cores and 24 threads. The 3900 XT has a boost clock of 4.7 GHz, while the 5900X has a boost clock of 5.8 GHz. You see gains of up to 50% in titles like League of Legends and CSGO, and we also see some modest gains in games like Battlefield 5 and Total War 3 Kingdoms. These two processors were released 4 months apart, so you can see how significant gains are. Moving on, we see the the gaming performance gains with the 5900X as well as the 5950X. These are the two top-end SKUs that AMD has this time. We see that most games perform better on the 5900X versus the 5950X. Now, this is because video games in general favor lower latency processors, and the 5900X has fewer cores in it, which is why you have lower latency because fewer cores take fewer time to talk to each other. Moving on, we'll be looking at the current lineup of the entire Ryzen 5000 series. We have four CPU models with us. Ryzen 5 5600X, that's a mid-range CPU, followed by the Ryzen 7 5800X, which is also a mid-range processor but towards the higher end of it. Then you have the absolute top-end Ryzen 9 5900X and the 5950X. You will see the processors being compared to their predecessors from the Zen 2 microarchitecture based Ryzen 3000 processors. Across the board, we see double-digit growth in three processors, and what stands out is the 18% improvement between the mid-range 3800X T and the 5800X. Again, these two processors were released 4 months apart, so within 4 months, getting 18% of performance uplift is quite significant. This particular test was Cinebench R20, and this is a multi-threaded performance benchmark. So a lot of reviewers, including us, we use Cinebench R20 to highlight single-threaded as well as multi-threaded performance gains between processor generations. Now, moving on, we have Cinebench again, which is the benchmark that we were talking about. And one aspect that we'd like to point out is up until Zen 3, we never saw CPUs cross 600 points in Cinebench R20 while running under stock conditions, not overclocked. This is the first time that any processor has crossed the 600 point barrier. Ryzen 9 5950X is at the lead with 640 points, followed by 629 points for the 5900X, 617 points for the 5800X, and the 5600X is a few points shy of hitting 600. But majority of the processors that you've seen in the first launch cycle of the 5000 series have broken the 600 point barrier. On the left, we can see the AMD Ryzen 9 3900 XT, which was released 4 months ago, and we can see it scored 456 points. And we also have a competition processor just for reference. Moving on, we're going to look at DaVinci Resolve, which is a popular video editing application that includes tools for color correction and audio and video post-production. It's a holistic suite when you're looking at video content creation. When Zen 2 is compared with Zen 3 in DaVinci Resolve, we see between 8 to 10% of performance gains. So content creators can use this particular information to judge if they'd like to upgrade from Zen 2 to Zen 3. Now, since we are the topic of upgrading, Zen 3 is a drop-in upgrade. What that means is that if you have a compatible Zen 3 motherboard, which is a B550 or an X570 motherboard, then you can simply update the BIOS to a Giza 1.0.8.0 and remove your Zen 2 processor and swap in a Zen 3 processor. That's all you need to upgrade from Zen 2 to Zen 3, a simple BIOS upgrade. The entire platform can remain the same. You don't need to change anything else. Now, we've looked at a lot of performance graphs overall, and most of them were focused on gaming. We looked at one which was around DaVinci Resolve and some industry benchmarks which focused on 3D rendering and movie creation. Now we are going to look at the graphics card along with the AMD processor. This is because AMD also announced the RDNA 2 based Radeon RX 6000 graphics cards on the 18th of November this year. And when you combine a AMD Ryzen Zen 3 processor with a Radeon RX 6000 series graphics card, you can get a little extra performance by switching on something called AMD Smart Access Memory. To do this, you'll need, again, a B550 motherboard or an X570 motherboard. since those are the ones which support Zen 3. Then you need to upgrade the BIOS again to AVISA 1.1.0.0 and switch on two options within the BIOS. One of them is called above 4G decoding, and the other one is called resize bar support. Resize bar support is a feature that's present in the PCIe Gen 4.0 standard, and what that does is basically allows the CPU to access the entirety of the GPU memory. This removes bottleneck and improves performance. Then again, we should also point out that game developers, if they want to make use of AMD Smart Access Memory, they'll have to make changes to their game engines and to their game overall. Over here, we see an average of 6% performance gains when you switch on Smart Access Memory. That is, when you have an AMD RX 6800 XT compared with the 6800 XT without SMA or SAM switched on. And this can vary across every single game. Sometimes you might actually see reductions, but the maximum so far attained has been 11%, and that's in Forza Horizon 4 running at ultra configuration. So it's not even at low configuration. So that's again quite significant. Moving on, we now come to Precision Boost Overdrive 2, which is a new boost technology algorithm that builds upon the benefits of the first iteration of this technology, which was called Precision Boost Overdrive, or PBO. That's what we're going to refer to from the next slide onwards. And it deserves the existing benefits which we've gone to and gives you more performance by introducing something called undervolting in a much simpler manner. So not only enthusiast overclockers, but even the average Joe can sort of experiment with undervolting now. So over here we see that Precision Boost Overdrive is targeted towards practically everyone, but enthusiasts and overclockers who would like to get a little extra performance are going to benefit vastly from it. It introduces a new tool called the Curve Optimization tool, which tries to opportunistically reduce voltage whenever possible. Now, this could be during low load situations or even during high load situations. The AMD Zen processors have something called a system management unit within each processor, which constantly monitors a wide set of parameters in order to understand when it can apply these optimizations. Now it looks at voltage, temperature, and frequency among other parameters, and whenever it can, it will try to reduce or optimize the voltage frequency curve. The SMU, which is a system management unit, is capable of performing this operation every millisecond. So that's 1000 optimizations being done every single second. And that can have tremendous gains in certain applications, not so much in something else. It really depends on the kind of headroom that you have, which again varies when you have high load versus low load. Also, it varies from processor to processor, as you'll see in the next slide. Now here we see three graphs, okay, and three graphs per processor. Very first one, which is the gray colored one, is the stock one, which is with no BIOS settings touched whatsoever. You're running the 5800X as well as the 5900X at their stock frequencies. And then you have the middle graph, which is Precision Boost Overdrive, which was the previous iteration of PBO2, along with a 200 megahertz boost override. So whatever boost that the processor is advertised for, you're adding 200 megahertz on top of that. So with that, you can see there is no gains between the 5800X running on PBO with the 200 megahertz boost override versus the stock. And in the case of the 5900X, which has a lot more cores, you see that the Precision Boost Overdrive along with 200 megahertz boost override has around 540 point increase. So that's quite significant right there. And then we have the third graph in both processors, which is with PPO2 activated. And we now see gains in both processors. In 5800X, the score goes up to 6095. This is Cinebench R20 multi-threaded benchmark. That compared to 5966 doesn't seem to be that much. And coming to the 5900X, we see the score jumping to 9054 points. Now that's tremendous considering that's about more than an 800 point increase compared to stock. So again, performance varies across the board from workload to workload. And in Cinebench R20, which is an industry benchmark, we can see significant gains. 800 points is no small task for the 5900X, whereas for 5800X, we don't see as much. So to recap, we've looked at the different architectural improvements made to Zen 3. We saw how each of those improvements helped enhance the performance of the Ryzen 5000 series of processors. Then we went into the major changes that helped with gaming in particular, including the merging of the two CCX into one. Then we looked at a lot of performance graphs for gaming, content creation, again, industry benchmarks. After that, we moved into smart access memory, which helps you get more performance when combining Zen 3 processors with Radeon RX 6000 graphics cards. And lastly, we looked at Precision Boost Overdrive 2, which is the latest overclocking technology introduced for Zen 3. We hope that a lot of your questions that you had given us during the registration period has been addressed by now. And for folks who have more questions to ask, please use the chat functionality and we'll start answering the same. I'll keep this slide in front of you while moving on. And start going through the questions. So the first question that we have is, this is from the bunch of registrations that we received. How fast and power efficient is it? We've seen that between Ryzen 3000 and Ryzen 5000, you don't need to change the motherboard. You don't need to upgrade to a higher VRM or a more robust VRM motherboard. These are drop-in replacements, which means if uh, let's say you had a Ryzen 9 3900 XT, which is a 105 TDP processor, you can replace it with a 5900X, which is again a 105 watt TDP processor. It's not designed for more load. It's going to give you the same, what you call, power consumption, or you could say similar power consumption. It's always varying on the basis of load, but it gives you significant performance gains. So that should answer that particular question. And then coming over here, we have one question from Modha K asking, when will it come in laptops? Again, this is a desktop processor. This, while it uses the same core as laptop processors, when AMD is going to announce Ryzen 5000 for laptops, is something we cannot comment on. It's completely up to AMD, and you'll get to know whenever they come out with it. But don't expect Ryzen 5000 processors in laptops for most. You might have certain high-end gaming laptops with Ryzen desktop processors, like that is the case with some SKUs from Alienware and MSI, who tend to use desktop processors along with in laptop configurations. So you could actually see what do you call, a Ryzen 5000 series processor in a laptop. Again, that's completely up to AMD. It's completely up to the manufacturer. We can only hope, because these processors are actually very, very good for gaming, as we've seen. Then we have a question about when we can expect the 5700X. So far, we have not been given any idea about additional processors coming into the lineup. As of now, we just have 4 processors which are right in front of you: the 600X, 5800X, 5900X, and 5950X. Looking at the previous generation, that is 3700X, it had the same core count as 3800X. So we could assume that the 5700X could have the same core count as the 5800X. So if you wish to upgrade right now, you have the 5800X to meet your particular need. Then you have another question about 4000 series. Is that for laptop only? Yes, the Ryzen 4000 series of APUs were designed for laptops only. Then we have a couple of hellos. One question by Rahul Rawat asking for a recommendation for an AMD 5000 series laptop. We don't have any idea about the AMD Ryzen 5000 series making it into laptops. And secondly, laptop processors are completely different from desktop processors because they are designed for much lower thermal conditions and a lot more power efficient. So that's something we can't answer. You'll just have to wait and watch. Then we have Swapnil Mathur, who happens to be a colleague of mine, who's asking for someone who already has a Ryzen 7 3700X, would it make sense to upgrade to these new chips? Well, Swapnil, it completely depends on what you're trying to do. Since you have a high core count processor, I would assume that you're mostly looking for multi-threaded performance increment, and in that case you could look at the 5900X because compared to the 3900X it had a 12% increase in performance. So we can actually compare and see how much of an increment it has versus 3700X and give you a better picture of how much the performance gains will be. But even without that information, I can at least tell you that it's going to be double digit performance increase. And if you're looking at high core count, that means you're probably looking at video rendering and export loads, which will benefit immensely from higher frequency, higher core count processors. Then we have another question about the 5700X. It seems to be quite a popular demand. So if AMD representatives are on this AMA, please do note the demand for the 5700X. Then we have a question from Ankit Sharma. What will be the future of laptops given that Ryzen 5000 and RTX 3000 series? Can we expect Ryzen 5000 based models, or will AIBs be sticking with Ryzen 4000? Again, we can't comment on behalf of AMD or manufacturers, but given the fact that Ryzen 5000 series processors are really good at gaming, you can only hope that manufacturers take cognizance of that fact and try to bring in Ryzen 5000 for laptops. But then again, the only instance where we've seen desktop processors, now I see a desktop because Ryzen 5000 series right now is a desktop processor, being present in gaming laptops are at the absolute high end, the absolute top end. These are gaming laptops that will cost more than 3.5 lakhs. So if that's the kind of expenditure that you're looking at, then certainly you can hope and put out a few inquiries to the vendors or manufacturers regarding the introduction of Ryzen 5000. But I highly suspect they'll never answer those things unless the launch just right around the corner. Usually when you start seeing leaks for new processor and CPU launches, you can sort of start a counter, a 6 month counter, because that's how far it usually is before the actual launch happens. Then, okay, we have multiple questions about expected Indian pricing, and there is a lot of there are a lot of comments around controlling pricing. We should note that this is the launch window. The processors have been out for barely a month. They were selling out super quick off the shelves in barely one day, and stocks were being repleted on a regular basis. And now we started seeing more stocks arrive in the market. So if you happen to be on, let's say, Amazon, or if you're checking the prices on popular component websites like RAMABGB, MD Computers, Vedant, and all those guys, you'll see these processors being in stock more often than previously. So Once the stock situation improves, the pricing will obviously follow. Then we have Dragon Force, who's asking, I'm planning to get a new system. What would you recommend? Third generation Ryzen 5 CPU or second generation Ryzen 7, as the price has come down? So, if those are your choices, then I would definitely ask you to look at the third generation Ryzen 5, because that's immensely more performant compared to second generation Ryzen 7, primarily due to improvements in single threaded performance. However, if you wanted, let's say, additional cores, then the Ryzen 7 is more beneficial. It's very situational and it depends on the kind of workloads that you're running. But if you're actually looking at third generation Ryzen 5 CPU, I'm going to assume that you're looking at the 3600X XT or 3600X. Those things start from 18,000 rupees in the market and go up to 22,000 or 23,000 for the 3600 XT. Now, the 5600 XT sells for 25,500. So the price difference between the two is barely 2,500, and the performance difference is massive. So if you're considering the Ryzen 5 3600X, I would say you would sort of wait and you should look at the Ryzen 5 5600X, because that's going to be a better buy, and the extra 2,500 rupees that you have to pay is very much worth the performance gains that you're going to get. Then you have another question from Dragon Force, who's asking, what is the best memory for Ryzen? Now, most of the memory manufacturers in the market have specific SKUs built for Ryzen platforms. These are sort of like best use case scenario models. So using those, you're destined to get slightly more stable clocks. But if you have a memory kit which uses Samsung B-die chips, then you can simply look for something called as the Ryzen Memory Timing Calculator. It's a small piece of software that is hosted at several places on the internet. Download that, feed in all the metrics of your RAM module, and it'll give you detailed calculations of all the single clock timings, that is for the axis of the rows, the gas, and everything. You take those timings, feed it into the BIOS. Now, this is slightly complicated, but once you do that, you are more likely to get a stable system overall, because you've adapted your existing DDR4 memory kit for your new Ryzen system. Now, that's one aspect of figuring out what memory kit to get. The second thing is about the sweet spot of Ryzen memory. Now, with both Ryzen 3000 as well as Ryzen 5000 series, the sweet spot was at 34 to 3600 megahertz when you're trying to get the most amount of performance. After that, you get negligible gains. That has changed with the Ryzen 5000 series of processors. So now the sweet spot is 200 megahertz higher. So if you're trying to get a bit more performance, try to get memory kits for around 3600 megahertz to 3800 megahertz and switch those in. You're going to get slightly better performance, and anything over 3800 megahertz, that completely depends upon your processor as well as the timings that you feed in. You could get more performance, but 99% you're going to get negligible gains above that. Then we have a question about uh, the Mac Pro SoC. Is it going to beat either Intel or AMD? Well, honestly, we have not received the Mac Pro with the new M1 processor, so we don't know what kind of performance metrics that is capable of, because to form a holistic judgment about one processor being better than the other, you need to test it across multiple workloads. We saw 25 workloads in one of the slides in this presentation, and it's only after you run different workloads for different genres that you get a good idea of how good a processor is compared to another one. Now we've run through most of the questions in the live chat, so I'm going to move on to the questions that you guys gave us during the registration. This one about the power efficiency of Ryzen 5000. Now we've seen that the Ryzen 5000 series as well as the Ryzen 3000 series, they are analogous in terms of TDP. So these are drop-in processors, so you don't need to upgrade your motherboard or switch to a better motherboard. That's because these things are power efficient. And the fact that you have something called precision boost overdrive 2, which most motherboards will have the bias for that in January 2021, that's going to opportunistically reduce the voltage that is required by the processor at different workloads. So you might actually see significant performance gains as well as power reduction, that is power efficiency, when you turn on precision boost overdrive. So once those buys for popular motherboards are released in Jan 2021, we'll be able to test out PBO2 and give you a better idea of the power efficiency of Ryzen 5000. But given the data that we have right now, compared to Ryzen 3000, Ryzen 5000 is a lot more efficient, and it gives you more performance per watt, because you understand that the TDP for both things is the same, that's the thermal design, but the actual power consumed, that is by the processor, is also quite similar, and you're getting more performance in the Ryzen 5000 series. So if you're getting more performance in the same power envelope, that means it's more efficient. So hopefully that answers that question. Then we have a question about the role of Infinity Fabric between CCXs. Now, Infinity Fabric happens to be the interconnect technology that AMD has for communication between different components within the processor. Now, here we move back to the topology slide where we can see the two different CCDs communicating with CIODs. Now, this happens within this area itself. So these are the two CCDs, and this is CIOD. They are using Infinity Fabric to talk to each other. Now, this is an interconnect standard which is used by AMD for a lot of products. So, aside from the inter chip or inter die communication, AMD also use Infinity Fabric for a lot of other applications. And one thing I touched upon previously is that the Infinity Fabric is tied to your DRAM frequency. So if you switch to a higher RAM kit, a higher frequency RAM kit, then you're going to get significantly more performance because the Infinity Fabric gets sped up on the basis of your RAM frequency. So your CCDs and CIODs are going to talk to each other much quickly. So if there's anything pending between them, let's say it's been dropped into L3 or L2 cache, and something that the processor is going to come to later, it'll no longer need to have to do that because the Infinity Fabric will ensure that those things are dealt with much quicker. The end thing is that it's basically an interconnect standard, and it's used by AMD within a lot of IP. Then there's a question of how SAM works, that is Smart Access Memory. We've already gone over that. Then we have a question about updates about the non-X version of the Ryzen 5000 series. AMD does not comment about future launches, and even we have no idea about non-X variants coming in. Even if we did, we'd be bound by an embargo to not reveal those things. So I can't help you with this. And I can only say you gotta wait and watch. Then we have a question from Aceville who asks, how does this give a greater edge to gamers? We've gone through that in quite a lot of detail. We've seen how the the CCXs have been combined together to reduce latency, and on top of that, a lot of changes have also been made within the entire structure of the processor in the front end, the execution as well as the load store bit, to give different enhancements, and all of that has resulted in better gaming performance. Not just gaming, but practically better performance across the board. And the figure is right in front of you. That is a 19% IPC uplift between Zen 2 and Zen 3. Then, what's the best clock speed? No idea who's asked this question. I can go back into the slide, the very second slide. Right now we have Zen 3 processors which have a max boost of 4.9 gigahertz, but you should always remember that you now have something called Precision Boost Overdrive, which Precision Boost Overdrive 2, which can alter your voltage frequency curve to give you a lot more performance. And there's also something called the normal boost, that is AMD's Precision Boost, which opportunistically increases the clock frequency whenever it can. And then you have an override for 200 megahertz. So considering all those things, and you should always have good cooling, because a lot of these things depend upon your processor being cool. So if you can manage all of these things together, you can get really good performance gains. And we saw that in the case of the Ryzen 9 5900X. It was nearly, or rather more than 800 points in Cinebench R20. So that's quite significant. Then we have one question, which is how much different is it from the Ryzen 3000 series of processors, and why is there so much difference in performance? Again, I just answered that question, so that's probably taken care of. Then, according to the company, a budget gamer, should they purchase Zen 3 processors or not? Well, honestly, you'll have to give us an idea about the budget to give you a more tailor-made response. Right now, the lowest core count processor that you can get is the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is a 6-core multi-threaded processor. 6 cores is what most games use when it comes to a processor, so it's very optimal. But I don't know if that's within your budget, because it costs around 25,000 rupees. And if your budget happens to be lower, that is around 12 to 13,000 rupees, then I would say you should check out the Ryzen 3 3100 and the 3300X. Both of them are really good for gaming workloads. We've tested them several times in the past, and what we found is that those things tend to beat 3-year-old flagships. So you have really good processors in the Ryzen 3 range. If your budget is around 25K, then you have a 5600X, which you can buy right now, which is in the Zen 3 lineup. Then we have a question that's comparing Ryzen 4000 to 5000. Again, this is not a valid comparison, because the two processor families are built for different platforms. Ryzen 4000 is for laptops, Ryzen 5000 is for desktops. They operate within different power envelopes, so it's like comparing apples to oranges. So if you are looking at power efficiency and performance increment, I would say you should wait for the next gen Ryzen laptop processors and try to see the performance between that and the desktop 5000 series. Even that's a bit weird, but that's the closest that you can get. We have more questions about 5000 series coming in laptops. Again, we've answered that already. And there's a question about the memory controller. Has that been changed? Nope. The CIOD has remained mostly the same. Whatever changes have been brought have been keeping in mind the changes that were introduced within the course. So nothing revolutionary over there. Then there's one question about long-term support for CPUs. Answering this would be kind of simple, because if you look at the AM4 platform, which is what AMD has been using since the very first Ryzen processors were announced in 2017. That has not changed. We've seen the X370 boards come out, followed by the X400, or the 400 series, and now we have the 500 series. All of them use the same AM4 socket. So far, we can say that AMD has made their platforms pretty future-proof. That is, if you ended up getting a first-gen Ryzen processor, then you could easily upgrade to Zen 2. But if you happen to have, let's say, a B550 motherboard, then as per AMD's chipset chart, which can be found on their website, so far they've only declared that it's capable of supporting Zen 2 and the upcoming Zen 3, and then quite a lot of the Zen 1 processors as well. So B550 supports a lot of the processor stack, whereas regarding future AM4 chipsets and platforms, we honestly can't comment on that. Then we have a question about how effective is AMD Ryzen 5000 in increasing AMD's market share. Again, I don't believe either AMD or the competition giving out numbers regarding market share. These numbers are usually released by consultancy firms like Gartner and IDC. So you'll have to keep an lookout for those consultancy agencies and the reports that they come out. Usually these things happen every quarter. So Ryzen 5000 series, because they've been released now, you should ideally look at the shift in market like 2 quarters down the line. So around mid 2021 would be when you get a good picture of how influential the Ryzen 5000 series have been. And what we've also observed is AMD tends to release optimizations or different processor lineups at either a 6 month interval, or if it's looking at a complete overhaul, then it could be anywhere from 1 year to 2 years. So 1 year down the line, you could probably see the next generation of Ryzen processors coming out, but we have no idea. So around Q2 to Q4 is when you get a really good idea of the impact of the Ryzen 5000 series on AMD's processor market share, that to desktop processor market share. Then we have a question about is it worth it to purchase the Ryzen 5 5500X over the Ryzen 3 3600? Well, one, the 5500X does not exist. You have Ryzen 5 5600X. Then a 3600 is not in the Ryzen 3 family. It's actually a Ryzen 5 processor. So if you're asking, is it worth to purchase the Ryzen 5 5600X or the Ryzen 5 3600X? We've seen that it very much is. You do get double-digit gains, and you can do so by just increasing your budget by 2,500 rupees, because that's the price difference between the two SKUs. Then we have another question about smart access memory. We've already gone through that. And then this question about how did they overcome, or rather how did they gain performance IPC from the FX series to the Ryzen series. The FX series are what AMD had before Zen processors were out. These were the Bulldozer and Excavator series of processors, and we saw that there was a 52% IPC uplift between the Excavator and Bulldozer series to the first generation of Ryzen. We have no idea about difference between Excavator to Zen 3. That is going to be much more, but you have the intergeneration performance uplifts. You have 52% between Zen and Excavator. You have 15% between Zen 2 and Zen, and then you have 19% between Zen 3 and Zen 2. So you can sort of calculate and get a good idea of how good it is compared to FX. Then we have a comment about pricing. We've already answered that. Is it enough for gaming? A lot of these questions don't have names of persons who are asking them. So sorry, I can't call you guys out to give you a shout out. But to answer your question, is it enough for gaming? We've seen the chart with the 25 gaming workloads. I'll just bring it up again. 14 of these workloads were within gaming, and we saw significant gains going all the way up to 39%. And that's in PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, so an extremely popular DirectX 11 title. So, is it good for gaming? Yes, it is. Then we have another question about longevity. Again, longevity is completely up to AMD. So far, given the history, we've seen the same platform being supported over and over again across a period of 3 years. Will that continue in the future? We can't comment, and it's completely up to AMD to answer that. Then we have a question about what's new in Zen 3 architecture. We've already gone through that. We are at roughly 47 questions right now. Oof. Let's see. Do they have a powerful APU than the Ryzen 5 3400G? And if yes, do they have more VRAM than the Ryzen 5 3400G? Now, no APUs have been announced for the Ryzen 5000 series, so you'll have to wait. Usually, it'll take about 6 to 8 months. It's completely up to AMD. There's no guarantee when it's coming, but if the demand is there, we don't see why not. And if you're asking about VRAM between the Ryzen 5 3400G and whatever is coming up next, VRAM is usually allocated within the system memory, the RAM. So uh, again, we can't comment on that, but 3400G, I believe, had reserved 2 GB from the system memory for VRAM whenever you're gaming. We could see the same being continued, or we could see something more. There's literally no reason for them to go down, so that's what we can hope. We can't comment on this thing for certainty, but you get a rough idea of that. Then we have more questions about what's new in Ryzen 5000. We've gone through that in significant detail. Again, questions about Ryzen 5000 series available for laptops. Again, we've gone through that multiple times over. Then we have a question about pricing for the processors. Okay, that's something we can definitely get into. So let me bring it up. So the top processor, which is the 5950X, has an SEP of 60,990. You need to add 18% GST on top of that. Then you have the 5900X, which is the 12 core processor. That thing goes for 49,540. That's including GST, that's not the SEP. Then you have the 5800X, which has an SEP of 34,490. And lastly, you have the Ryzen 5 5600X, which has an SEP of 22,990. So you can add the GST on top of these numbers and figure out exactly how much they cost. Then let's see if we have any more questions. It's also 6 p.m. So we've been going through this for roughly 1 hour right now. So if you have any more questions in the chat, please do put them across. Okay, you have a few comments over here which are quite valid. Then there's one about, is Digit testing any rig currently for reviewing it? We've actually reviewed the 5900X as well as the 5950X. You can head over to the website to check that out. And we've also reviewed the Radeon RX 6800 and the 6800 XT. Again, the review is up on the website. It's actually the first review on the slide, so you can check it out. In the Radeon review, we actually do compare it with a Ryzen processor. We put it in a Ryzen processor as well as a competition processor, and we also check out smart access memory, so you can get our results over there. Hmm. So then we have a comment. What do you think about manufacturers? Should they add at least some amount of video memory on board so that we can at least use the new CPU and get a dedicated GPU later? Well, adding a GPU and or an IGP integrated graphics processor has a certain amount of what do you call hit in terms of performance and power consumption. So uh, AMD basically takes a look at all their use cases and tries to figure out where APUs are essential and where CPUs are more what do you call optimal, which is why you see APUs mostly being catered in the budget segment, because that's where people tend to buy a processor first and then get a graphics card much later. Whereas people who are getting, let's say, a Ryzen 5 processor, Ryzen 7 processor, Ryzen 9 processor, they are spending a lot of money on processor, so it's kind of obvious that they'll be getting a graphics card right there. Now, I'm not saying it's completely illogical to wait for a graphics card later on. That's very much possible. Even I have done that in the past. But if you're looking for an intermediate graphics card, till you get the actual one, you can get stuff for as cheap as 3,000 bucks. So, and those things have good resale value as well. So, you can get a graphics card for 3,000 bucks and send it off to anyone else for roughly around the same, and you can make do. Then we have question from Fluffy, who's using a competition board along with 2060 Super GPU. Can they switch to an AMD Ryzen 5000 series processor on the same board? Uh, no, you can't use an AMD Ryzen processor on a competition board. You'll have to get an AMD B550 or an X570 chipset based motherboard. If you're looking at gaming, then I would say the 5600X should be more than sufficient, because 6 cores are what most video games use. But we've also observed in our reviews and even in the slide over here, let me bring that up, that the 5900X actually performs better than the 5950X in quite a few games. So if you want, let's say, really good gaming experience with money not being a bar, then try to get the 5900X. But if you're just looking at something to switch from your existing system to AMD, then start off with 5600X and you should have absolutely no problems with gaming. And with that, we've actually run through all the questions in the live chat. We've also gone through roughly 48 questions that were captured during the initial registration process. So I think we've actually done well on the AMA part. That's it for this particular AMA on the AMD Ryzen 5000 series. We went through a lot of the processor families, including the actual microarchitecture, its performance impact in gaming, content creation, and quite a lot of other areas. We've gone through plenty of performance graphs, and I hope we've answered most of your questions. If not, please do feel free to put down questions in the comments over here in the live chat functionality, or even after the video as live stream has ended, because we're going to be monitoring these comments for a few more hours, and we'll try to answer as many of those as possible. Again, I'd like to thank you on behalf of all my colleagues who are supporting me in the comments, moderating the chat, and hopefully from AMD as well. Thank you for joining, and we'll have more AMAs planned in the future. We're certainly looking at something around the Radeon RX 6000 series, so stay tuned for that. Check out our social media channels, and we'll give you notifications and information as to when that's happening soon enough. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.